Welcome to Capy's Bedtime Stories. Hope you enjoy the story, The Harvest Draw. Part 1, The Dry Days. The town of Emberfield wasn't much to look at anymore. Once, it had been a patchwork of golden wheat and sprawling orchards, the kind of place people stopped to photograph on their way through. Now, it was a cracked, dusty sprawl of yellowed fields and skeletal trees clawing at the sky. The river that used to snake through the valley had shriveled into a muddy ditch years ago, and the air carried the faint, bitter scent of dying earth. For as long as Lila Carter could remember, the grown-ups had been muttering about the dry days, as if naming it made it less terrifying. Lila was 16, with tangled brown hair she never bothered to brush, and a habit of asking questions no one wanted to answer. She leaned against the splintered porch railing of her family's sagging farmhouse, staring out at the horizon where the sun hung like an angry red eye. It was late August, the time of year when the heat pressed down so hard it felt personal. Tomorrow was the harvest draw, and the whole town was buzzing with a nervous energy she couldn't stand. "Why do we even do this dumb thing?" she muttered, kicking at a loose board. Her voice barely carried over the dry wind, rattling the empty corn stalks nearby. Her mother, Ellen, poked her head out the screen door, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Don't start, Lila. It's tradition. Keeps us going." "Keeps what going? The dirt," Lila shot back. "We've been doing this forever, and the fields still look like a graveyard." Ellen's lips tightened into a thin line. She was a wiry woman, all sharp edges and tired eyes, worn down by years of hoping for rain that never came. "It's not about the fields, it's about us. You'll see tomorrow." Lila rolled her eyes and turned back to the horizon. She hated how her mom always talked in riddles, like the harvest draw was some sacred mystery, instead of a weird old ritual everyone pretended made sense. Every year, the townsfolk gathered in the square, stuck their hands in a beat-up wooden box, and pulled out slips of paper. One of them, always one, had a red dot. And then, well, Lila wasn't totally sure what happened after that. The adults never talked about it straight, and the kids weren't allowed to watch the end. All she knew was that someone didn't come home, and everyone acted like it was normal. The screen door creaked again, and her little brother, Jamie, shuffled out. He was 9, small for his age, with a mop of sandy hair and a permanent, worried crease between his brows. "Are you scared?" he asked, clutching a toy truck with a missing wheel. "Of what? The draw," Lila snorted. "No, it's stupid. They should be figuring out how to fix the pumps or dig a new well, not playing lottery with paper scraps." Jamie didn't look convinced. "Milo says it's to wake up the land, like a trade." "Milo's an idiot," Lila said, though she didn't mean it. Milo was her best friend, a lanky kid with a gap-toothed grin who lived 3 houses down. He was obsessed with the draw, always spouting theories about how it worked. Last year, he'd told her he thought the red dot picked someone to feed the earth, whatever that meant. She'd laughed it off then, but now, with the draw looming, it didn't seem so funny. "Go inside, Jamie," she said, softer this time. "You don't need to worry about it." He hesitated, then scampered back in, the door banging shut behind him. Lila stayed on the porch, watching the sky bleed into dusk. She wondered if her dad would say anything about it tonight. He usually didn't. Tom Carter was a quiet man, big and broad-shouldered, who spent most of his time tinkering with broken machinery in the barn. But lately, he'd been quieter than usual, his hands fidgeting whenever the draw came up. Dinner was the same as always, thin potato soup and a chunk of stale bread. The silence around the table was thick, broken only by the clink of spoons. Lila poked at her bowl, her stomach twisting. "So," she said finally, "who's picking for us tomorrow?" Her parents exchanged a glance. "I am," her dad said, his voice low and rough. "Same as last year." "Why not me?" Lila pressed. "I'm old enough. Milo's doing it for his family." "No," Ellen snapped, slamming her spoon down. "You're not. End of story." Lila glared at her. "I'm 16, not a baby. I can handle pulling a stupid piece of paper." "It's not about the paper," her dad said, staring at his bowl like it held some secret. "It's about what comes after." "What does come after?" Lila leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "No one ever says it. What happens to the person with the red dot?" The room went still. Jamie stopped chewing, his wide eyes darting between them. Ellen's face hardened. You don't need to know that yet, she said. When you're older. I'm old enough to know it's messed up. Lila cut in, her voice rising. We're all just pretending it's fine, but it's not. Someone disappears, and we act like it's no big deal. Lila, enough, her dad barked, slamming his hand on the table. The soup bowls rattled. Jamie flinched, and Ellen shot Tom a look that could have cut glass. Lila shoved her chair back and stormed outside, the screen door banging in her wake. The night air was cooler but still dry, stinging her throat as she gulped it down. She paced the yard, kicking up clouds of dust, her mind racing. She wasn't wrong. She couldn't be. The harvest draw was insane, and she was tired of everyone acting like it was holy. Tomorrow she'd see it for herself. No matter what they said, she wasn't staying on the sidelines this time. Part 2. The morning of the draw. Lila barely slept. The night had been a restless tangle of half-dreams, fields swallowing people whole, her dad's hands stained red, Jamie's toy truck spinning in circles through endless dust. When the first gray light crept through her cracked window, she was already up, tugging on her sneakers and a faded hoodie. Her parents wouldn't notice her sneaking out. They never did this early. She needed answers, and Milo was the only one who might have them. The air outside was still cool, a rare mercy before the sun turned it scorching. She cut through the brittle cornfield behind their house, the stalks crunching under her feet like old bones. The abandoned tractor sat a half-mile out, its rusted frame hunched over like a tired giant. Milo was already there, perched on the hood, tossing pebbles into a dented bucket. His gangly legs dangled over the edge, and his messy black hair stuck out in every direction. "Took you long enough," he said without looking up. His voice had that lazy drawl she usually found funny, but today it grated on her. "Couldn't sleep," she muttered, climbing up beside him. The metal was cold against her thighs. "You." He shrugged, tossing another pebble. It clinked against the bucket with a hollow ring. "Grandpa kept me up. He's been talking about the draw nonstop. Says it's the only reason we're still alive." Lila snorted. "Yeah, right, alive in a dust bowl." She kicked at a rust flake, watching it drift down like ash. What'd he say this time? Milo's eyes flicked to hers, bright and sharp despite the shadows under them. "He says it started way back, like 50 years ago. There was a drought worse than this, killed half the town. People were starving, fighting over the last scraps. Then someone came up with the draw. First time they did it, it rained the next day. Like real rain, not that drizzle we get sometimes. Grandpa swears the fields were green by the end of the week." "That's bull," Lila said, crossing her arms. "Rain doesn't work like that. It's just a coincidence they turned into some creepy religion." "Maybe." Milo leaned back, staring at the sky. "But he showed me this old photo. Him and his dad standing in a wheat field, tall as me. That was right after a draw. You can't fake that." Lila frowned. She hated how Milo's stories always sounded halfway believable, like there was just enough truth to make her doubt herself. "So what, you think burying someone in dirt makes the clouds cry or something? That's insane." "Not burying," he corrected, sitting up straighter. "Feeding. Grandpa says the earth's alive, kinda, like it's hungry. The draw gives it what it wants, and it gives us back the harvest." She stared at him, waiting for the punchline. It didn't come. "You're serious," she said finally. "You actually believe that?" "I don't know." He rubbed the back of his neck, sheepish. "I mean, it's weird, yeah, but something's keeping this place going. You've seen the pumps, they've been dry for years. The wells, too, we should all be dead by now." Lila opened her mouth to argue, then shut it. He wasn't wrong. Emberfield was a ghost of a town, clinging to life on nothing but stubbornness. The irrigation pipes her dad spent hours fixing were corroded husks, and the last time they'd tapped a well, it spat out sand. Still, the idea of some mystical trade with the dirt made her skin crawl. "We're watching it today," she said suddenly, her voice firm. "The end. No more hiding behind your too young crap. I need to see what happens." Milo's grin faded. "They'll kill us if we get caught." "They won't catch us," she shot back. "We'll hide, behind the shed or something, you in or not." He hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, okay, but if we're doing this, we stick together. No bailing." "Deal." She hopped off the tractor, landing in a puff of dust. "Meet me at the square before it starts, and don't chicken out." He flashed that gap-toothed grin she knew too well. "Never." The walk home was quieter, her mind churning. Milo's story stuck with her like a splinter, ridiculous but nagging. By the time she slipped back through the kitchen door, the house was awake. Jamie sat at the table, spooning watery oatmeal into his mouth, while her mom hovered over the stove. Her dad was gone, probably already in the barn. "Where'd you go?" Ellen asked, not turning around. Her tone was sharp, like she already knew the answer wouldn't matter. "Just outside," Lila lied, grabbing a bowl. "Needed air." Her mom didn't push it, but the silence felt heavy. Jamie kept sneaking glances at her, his little hands tight around his spoon. "Are we gonna be okay today?" he whispered when Ellen stepped out to the porch. Lila forced a smile. "Yeah, kid, we're fine. Don't worry." But her stomach twisted as she said it. The morning dragged on, thick with unspoken tension. She caught her mom polishing a bucket, the kind they used to haul dirt from the fields. It didn't make sense. They hadn't planted anything worth tending in months. Out in the barn, her dad was sharpening a shovel, the screech of metal on stone echoing through the walls. When she asked why, he just grunted and kept working. By noon, the town was stirring. Families trickled toward the square, their footsteps kicking up clouds that hung in the still air. Lila pulled on her hoodie again, slipping a pocket knife into her jeans, just in case. She didn't know what she expected, but she wasn't going in blind. Milo was waiting by the old oak at the edge of the square, his hands stuffed in his pockets. The crowd was already growing, maybe 50 people, all worn faces and hushed voices. The wooden box sat on a rickety table in the center, its edges splintered and stained. Mr. Harris stood beside it, tall and gaunt, his gray suit hanging off him like a scarecrow's rags. He held a clipboard, barking names as people shuffled forward. "You ready?" Milo whispered, his breath hot against her ear. Lila nodded, her throat dry. "Let's find out what they're hiding." Part 3. The ceremony. The square was a sea of dust and nervous faces by the time Lila and Milo squeezed through the crowd. The sun blazed overhead, baking the cracked earth underfoot into a hard, unyielding slab. The wooden box loomed in the center, its presence heavy despite its battered simplicity. Around it, the townsfolk stood in loose clusters, parents clutching kids' hands, old men muttering prayers, women twisting aprons or shawls in their fists. Lila's heart thudded against her ribs, loud enough she swore Milo could hear it. Mr. Harris cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the murmur like a rusty blade. "All right, folks, let's get this done. You know the rules. One picker per family. Step up when I call you." He adjusted his clipboard, squinting at the names scrawled in faded ink. Lila scanned the crowd for her parents. Her dad stood near the front, his broad shoulders slumped, hands shoved deep in his pockets. Her mom was a few steps back, holding Jamie close. His wide eyes darted around, taking in the scene like it was his first time. Technically, it was. Kids under 10 didn't have to come, but this year, Ellen had insisted. Lila wondered why, then pushed the thought away. She had bigger things to focus on. "Carter!" Harris barked. Her dad shuffled forward, his boots dragging in the dirt. The crowd parted silently, watching as he reached into the box. His big hand hesitated, hovering over the pile of folded slips before plunging in and pulling one out. He unfolded it slowly, his face unreadable. White, no red dot. A collective exhale rippled through the onlookers, and Lila felt her own breath hitch loose. She hadn't realized she'd been holding it. "Next, Brennan," Harris called. Milo stiffened beside her, his family. Lila grabbed his arm, her fingers digging in. "It's fine," she whispered, though she didn't believe it. "Just paper, right?" He nodded, but his jaw was tight as his dad, Mr. Brennan, stepped up. The man was wiry, all sinew and sunburn, with the same dark hair as Milo. He didn't hesitate, reached in, pulled a slip, and unfolded it in one fluid motion. The red dot stared back like a drop of fresh blood. A gasp sucked the air from the square. Milo's mom, a small woman with tired eyes, clutched her husband's arm. "No," she whispered, barely audible. "Not us." Harris's voice was flat. "Brennan family draws the mark. Pick your offering." Lila's stomach lurched. Offering? She'd heard the word before, whispered in church, muttered over dinner, but never like this. Milo's dad turned to his wife, his face crumpling. "I'll go," he said, low and hoarse. "No," Milo's mom yanked him back. "You can't, the kids." "I said I'll go," he snapped, loud enough to make heads turn. But Harris stepped in, his bony hand raised. "Family decides together. Now." The Brennans huddled, their voices a frantic buzz. Lila couldn't hear the words, but she saw Milo's mom shaking her head, tears streaking her dust-caked cheeks. His dad kept pointing at himself, insistent, desperate. Then Milo's little sister, Ellie, only 6, tugged at her mom's skirt and the woman's resolve broke. She straightened, wiped her face, and faced Harris. "Me," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I'll do it." Milo lunged forward, but Lila caught his wrist. "Wait," she hissed. "We can't." "Let go," he snarled, wrenching free. His eyes were wild, but he didn't run, not yet. The crowd was shifting, adults nudging kids toward the edges of the square. Ellen appeared, grabbing Jamie and shoving him toward a group of younger ones. "Go with them," she ordered, then shot Lila a hard look. "You too." "I'm not a kid," Lila snapped, planting her feet. Her mom's face darkened, but before she could argue, Harris clapped his hands. "Clear the square, pickers and witnesses only." The kids scattered, some crying, some dragging their feet. Lila grabbed Milo's sleeve and pulled him toward the shed at the square's edge, a rickety thing with peeling paint and a clear view of the center. "Come on," she muttered. "We're watching." They ducked behind it, crouching low as the crowd thinned. Through the gaps in the slats, they saw the adults form a loose circle around Milo's mom. She stood alone now, her husband and Ellie gone with the others. Her hands shook as she clasped them in front of her, but her chin was up, defiant. Harris stepped back, nodding to a group of men, Lila's dad included, who carried buckets and shovels. The buckets were the kind her mom had polished that morning, brimming with dry, crumbly soil from the fields. The shovels glinted dully in the sunlight, freshly sharpened. "What are they doing?" Milo whispered, his voice cracking. Lila didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat was too tight, her mind racing to make sense of it. The men set the buckets down in a ring around Milo's mom, then stepped back. Harris raised his clipboard like a preacher with a Bible. "For the harvest," he intoned. "For the earth that feeds us. We give what it demands." "For the harvest," the crowd echoed, their voices flat and mechanical. Then it started. A woman, Mrs. Tate from down the road, picked up a bucket and flung the soil at Milo's mom. It hit her chest, crumbling down her dress in a dusty cloud. She flinched but didn't move. Another man followed, then another, each tossing handfuls or whole buckets. The air thickened with grit, stinging Lila's eyes even from their hiding spot. "Stop it," Milo choked, starting to stand, but Lila yanked him down. "They'll see us," she hissed, her nails digging into his arm. "We can't." "She's my mom," he yelled, shoving her off, but he didn't run. He couldn't. His legs buckled, and he sank back, trembling. The dirt kept coming. Milo's mom staggered under the weight, her knees buckling as the soil piled around her feet, then her waist. She didn't scream, didn't beg, just stood there, her face a mask of dirt and tears until it covered her chest, her shoulders. The crowd worked faster now, methodical, like they were planting a crop. Lila's dad joined in, his shovel scooping earth and dumping it without a glance at the woman in the center. Lila clapped a hand over her mouth, bile rising in her throat. This wasn't a game. It wasn't a story. It was real, too real, and she couldn't unsee it. Milo's mom's head tilted back, her mouth open in a silent gasp, and then the dirt swallowed her entirely. The last bucket fell and the square went still. Harris brushed his hands together, satisfied. "It's done, go home." The crowd dispersed, heads down, buckets abandoned in the dust. Lila's dad lingered, staring at the mound where Milo's mom had been, then turned away. No one spoke. No one looked back. Milo was shaking beside her, his breaths ragged. "She's gone," he whispered. They killed her." Lila couldn't move. Her legs felt like lead, her mind blank except for the image of that dirt piling higher and higher. She'd wanted to know, now she did, and she wished she didn't. Part 4, the aftermath. Lila didn't remember walking home. Her legs moved on their own, dragging her through the dust-choked streets while Milo stumbled beside her, silent except for the occasional shuddering breath. The square was behind them now, but the image of that mound, dark, uneven, swallowing Milo's mom whole, burned behind her eyes. She couldn't blink it away. When they reached her porch, Milo stopped, staring at the ground. I can't go home, he said, his voice raw. Not yet. Stay here, Lila said, barely recognizing her own voice. It sounded hollow, like someone else was speaking. I need to talk to them. He nodded, sinking onto the steps without a word. She left him there, his head in his hands, and pushed through the screen door. The house smelled of stale bread and tension. Jamie sat on the floor, rolling his toy truck back and forth, while her mom scrubbed a pot in the sink like nothing had happened. Her dad wasn't there, probably back in the barn, hiding from whatever he'd just done. Lila stood in the doorway, fists clenched. What the hell was that? Ellen's hands stilled, but she didn't turn around. Watch your mouth, she said, her tone clipped. No, Lila's voice cracked, loud enough to make Jamie jump. You don't get to act like this is normal. You buried her, Milo's mom, with dirt, like she was nothing. Ellen set the pot down hard, the clang echoing in the quiet. She turned, her face tight with something that wasn't quite anger, fear, maybe, or guilt. It's not about her, it's about all of us. You saw the fields last year, nothing grew. We can't survive another season like that. So you kill someone. Lila stepped closer, her pulse hammering. That's your big plan. Murder. It's not murder, her mom snapped. It's a trade. The earth takes one and we get to keep going. It's been like that since before I was born. Lila laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. A trade? You sound insane. What kind of earth needs people to die for it? Ellen's eyes narrowed. The kind that's kept us alive when everything else failed. You think we want this? You think it's easy? Then stop, Lila shouted. Dig a well, fix the pumps. Do something that doesn't end with a grave. Her mom's hands shook, but before she could answer, the screen door creaked. Tom stepped in, his shovel still slung over his shoulder. Dirt clung to his boots, flecks of it dark against the worn wood floor. He looked at Lila, then away, his jaw tight. Tell her, Ellen said, her voice low. She won't listen to me. Tom set the shovel against the wall and rubbed his face, leaving a smear of grime on his cheek. There's no fixing it, Lila, he said finally. We tried. Years ago, before you were born, wells dried up, pumps broke, the river's gone. This is what works. Works, she stared at him, incredulous. You buried a woman alive. Milo's mom. How does that work? He flinched just barely, but enough for her to see it. It's not about her, he said, echoing Ellen. It's bigger than any of us. There's a force here, something in the land. We don't understand it, but we know it listens. One life, and it gives us back the rest. Lila's stomach twisted. A force? Like what, a god? You're making this up to feel better about what you did. We're not, Ellen cut in. You'll see. Give it a week. The fields will turn. They always do. I don't care about the fields. Lila's voice broke, tears stinging her eyes. I care that you're monsters, both of you. She stormed past them, shoving the door open so hard it slammed against the frame. Jamie called after her, but she didn't stop. Outside, Milo hadn't moved, still hunched on the steps. She dropped beside him, her breath ragged. They're crazy, she whispered. They think it's some magic deal with the ground. Milo didn't look up. Maybe it is, he mumbled. Grandpa said it'd happen, said it's why we're still here. Don't, she snapped. Don't you dare start believing that crap. Your mom didn't die for some stupid harvest. He lifted his head, his eyes red and hollow. Then why's she gone, Lila? Why'd they do it? She didn't have an answer. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until Milo stood and walked off without another word. She watched him disappear down the road, his shadow stretching long and thin in the fading light. The next few days were a blur. The town moved on like nothing had changed. People nodded greetings, swept porches, hung laundry. Milo didn't come by, and when Lila went to his house, his dad said he was resting. She didn't push. She couldn't face him yet, not with the guilt gnawing at her. She'd wanted to see the truth, and now it was a weight she couldn't shake. By the 5th day, she noticed it. A faint green haze creeping over the fields. She walked out to the edge of their property, her sneakers sinking into soil that wasn't as hard as it had been. Tiny sprouts poked through, wheat maybe, or something wild. Her chest tightened. It was real. The dirt that had swallowed Milo's mom was waking up. That night, the town buzzed with quiet excitement. Neighbors gathered in yards, marveling at the green. Her dad came home with a rare smile, holding up a handful of soft earth. See, he said, almost proud. It's working. Lila turned away, bile rising again. She locked herself in her room, staring out the window as the fields glowed faintly under the moon. It wasn't worth it. It couldn't be. But the proof was there, sprouting inch by inch, mocking her. She pressed her forehead against the glass, her breath fogging it up. I'm sorry, she whispered, to Milo, to his mom, to herself. She didn't know how to fix this, but she knew one thing: she couldn't live with it. Not like they did. Part 5. The choice. Lila couldn't sleep again, but this time it wasn't nightmares keeping her awake. It was the green. The fields outside her window shimmered in the dark, a soft, unnatural glow that crept closer every night. A week had passed since the draw, and the sprouts were knee-high now, swaying in a breeze that carried the faint, sweet scent of life. The town was drunk on it, neighbors laughing, kids chasing each other through the rows, her dad whistling while he sharpened tools. They'd won their harvest, paid for with Milo's mom, and no one seemed to care. She sat on her bed, knees pulled to her chest, the pocket knife from that day twirling between her fingers. The blade caught the moonlight, sharp and cold. She hadn't seen Milo since he walked away. His house stayed dark, curtains drawn, like a wound the town refused to look at. She'd tried knocking once, but no one answered. She didn't blame him for shutting her out. She'd pushed him to watch, and now they both carried it. Her parents' words echoed in her head. A trade, a force, what works? She hated them for it, hated how they'd folded into this like it was inevitable. But the green was real, undeniable, spreading like a promise kept. Maybe Milo's grandpa was right. Maybe the earth did demand something, but that didn't make it okay. She flipped the knife closed and stood, crossing to the window. The fields stretched out, endless and alive, mocking her with their beauty. She pressed her palm against the glass, her breath steadying. Not again, she whispered. Not next year. It wasn't a plan yet, just a spark, a defiance clawing up from the pit of her stomach. She didn't know how to stop the draw, not with the whole town behind it, not with the proof growing outside. But she couldn't live like this, pretending a life was a fair price for wheat. Maybe she'd burn the box. Maybe she'd dig up the pumps herself, force them to find another way. Or maybe she'd just run, take Jamie and Milo and leave this cursed place behind. The wind picked up, rattling the panes, and she imagined it carrying her words out to the fields, to whatever listened. You don't own us, she said, louder this time. I'll find a way. She didn't know if it heard her, or if it cared. But as she turned from the window, the spark flickered brighter, hardening into something she could hold on to. The harvest draw had taken enough. Next time she'd fight. The end. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more great stories on Capy's Bedtime Stories.